Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I want to talk to you guys today about how certain diets with exclusionary elements to them that kind of remove entire food groups of when they can actually become an eating disorder. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about this. Alright, diets like veganism, paleo diets, ketogenic diets, things like that, they're not automatically eating disorders, and I want to make that clear up front. I want people to understand I'm not saying that people who follow these diets are automatically have an eating disorder. I also want to differentiate between these diets being used to mask eating disorders versus them actually becoming an eating disorder, because there are different types of eating disorders. So we're going to talk in this video more about orthorexia nervosa rather than things like anorexia or bulimia. Because it is very popular and very trendy, particularly for young women, to take things like vegan diets or vegetarian diets and use them to hide their anorexia. Now, I've seen a case of someone doing this online, actually 2 cases of men doing this online in the fitness community who clearly have anorexia, who've chosen to become vegan, for example, while recovering from anorexia, and notice that they are not recovering from anorexia. I know one of them who at least looks extremely anorexic, still looks 50 pounds underweight. Probably is going to have to go back in and get medical treatment and inpatient therapy, and I don't want to say that to him, but I've seen one online who I know of who is absolutely going to experience this because they're using their vegan diet to mask their anorexia, to have an actual socially acceptable cover for their anorexia. So it's not about the animals for them, it's not about veganism, it's so that they can continue to starve themselves to death and tell people, no, I'm in recovery, I'm just doing something healthy and moral, I'm doing something moral while still starving myself, but it's okay, I'm not suffering from my anorexia. But that is a common use of these sort of diets, is to mask anorexia. Now, what we're going to talk about today is not that. That's a separate topic. I want to talk about how these diets themselves become an eating disorder. So when it comes to orthorexia nervosa, it comes in a lot of flavors, and this has been diagnosed within the last decade as an actual legitimate eating disorder. Orthorexia nervosa is generally defined as people who have an obsession, an unhealthy obsession, with having a clean food list or an acceptable food list and a bad food list. So good foods, bad foods. And unlike people who understand things like moderation, or people who have a serious intolerance or allergy, people who have a serious intolerance or allergy to a given food or a given substance within certain foods, it can be found naturally. That's totally different. For them, they have a real medical reason to completely avoid a food. All right, that's a little bit different. That's totally different because they have a reason to avoid it. When we're talking about for health purposes, anyone who has foods that they cannot ever have in moderation, and they're not on a doctor prescribed, or not on a diet prescribed by a doctor or prescribed by a registered dietitian for clinical purposes, meaning someone else has maybe advised them to go on this diet, and they have entire foods that they completely avoid. You guys have to understand the difference between being on a ketogenic diet versus that you've chosen to do versus a medical ketogenic diet. Medical ketogenic diets are a whole different beast, what's prescribed for people for specific medical causes by registered dietitians, particularly for things like epilepsy. Totally different animal. Most people would find it very unpalatable. They wouldn't be happy with the medical ketogenic diet because they're actually 80% fat. So, we're talking about people who have foods they completely exclude because they're bad foods. When you get into the mindset to where you have a strict list of good foods and bad foods based upon some preconceived idea or preconceived notion, you are getting over towards orthorexia nervosa. You're going in that direction, particularly when it's not even supported by the scientific literature. For example, when people have this and it starts to cause them any distress, that's where we get into problem. That's how we define it. But generally, we're starting to go that direction when people have a list of good and bad foods. And not in the sense of morally good and bad, because veganism is a little different of an animal because there is an ethical component to it too. These people oftentimes have strong ethics about it. And I can understand that. People who have a strong love of animals, they don't want to see animal cruelty, they don't want to see animal suffering, will have that. And, for example, I met a vegan couple, a married couple who were vegans, and had a chat with them about it. They actually, it was an ethical issue for them. It was not a health issue. And for example, they had ordered some takeout that was supposed to be vegan, and it was sent to them, and it had chicken in it. And because of their ethics, they said, look, this chicken has already been killed, it's been sent to us. We don't like this fact, but we chose to eat that meal because we think it would be even worse that this chicken was killed. They felt the chicken was inhumanely killed and slaughtered, and if they didn't eat it, they would be just throwing it away, and that would be even worse to them. So they chose to eat it. They weren't happy about it, but they made the choice to eat that meal that had been sent to them incorrectly so that this animal wouldn't have died completely in vain. And they chose to let that company know, and they chose to never use their services again because of the mistake they made. But they ate the food. It's the complete avoidance of a food because it's on your bad list, because you believe it's so unhealthy that you can't have it even in trace amounts, that we start getting towards orthorexia. But there'll be a defining component about distress at the end. For example, particularly when science disagrees with you, meaning if you're a vegan and you honestly believe that lean protein sources are so unhealthy that you can't have even a trace amount. Barring your ethics aside, your ethics are a different story, but look at the ethical situation I just gave of a real life example from a vegan couple who I had spoken to in person a few years back. In-person conversation. So they chose to eat it anyways, even though it was because of their ethical reasons. Now, if someone is a vegan who honestly, really, and truly believes that they can't have even the most trace amount of lean animal proteins, like grilled chicken or grilled turkey, because it's so unhealthy that it's on their bad food list, they're delusional. That is disordered thinking because it's not true. That's not supported by the scientific literature. Registered dietitians disagree, medical doctors disagree. Only a small little group of quacks promote that. So they've latched onto something that isn't true, that most researchers would say, no, you're wrong, you're crazy, it's not true, you've been misled. Lean proteins are perfectly fine. As long as you're not eating them in extreme excess, they're probably fine. There's nothing wrong with lean meat. It can be part of a perfectly healthy, balanced, normal diet you can live to be 100 on. All right, so when they're taking that stance and they've got that on a list like that, that's a problem. Same thing, people following a paleo diet who say, oh, I can't have any grains. Well, really? All the registered dietitians in the world say whole grains are perfectly healthy. You can eat large amounts of whole grains. They won't harm your health in any way. Perfectly healthy, perfectly acceptable. The scientific literature all agrees. The scientific literature doesn't have an issue with it unless you have a specific intolerance like celiac disease. Then there's no reason to think that eating large amounts of whole grains is unhealthy in any way for you. All the experts agree, but a person has it on their bad food list and they completely avoid them. All right, that's when we're getting towards this orthorexia nervosa, because people are avoiding them because they believe these actually healthy foods that all the top experts in the world agree are part of a healthy, balanced diet, that they're avoiding them due to health concerns that they can't have trace amounts. They've got a good food list, bad food list. That's, again, the traits of orthorexia. Now, when does it actually become full-blown orthorexia nervosa instead of pushing that direction? When you start to suffer distress for it. When it starts to stress you in any way, or you start to feel social stress and social pressure that upsets you as a result of it. When it causes you some form of social ostracization, hurts you socially in some way, or causes you personal distress because of your good and bad food list, this is when we've got a problem. So that you find yourself in social situations and you get upset at the fact that other people can consume this food and you can't, and it causes you stress, or your family starts to put peer pressure on you and it bothers you because you feel like it's interfering with your social life, that you can't go to a social gathering, a Christmas party, or a Thanksgiving party, or whatever your cultural holidays happen to be with your family, and there's foods there that you can't eat even in moderation because of your good and bad food list. and you start to feel socially ostracized because of it. Well, the moment you start to feel socially awkward or ostracized because of it, because that's now causing you distress, then your good food list and your bad food list has become an eating disorder, because it's now causing you stress in your life. That it's become abnormal. It's become abnormal to the point to where you feel you no longer fit in a social situation as a result of it. And again, it's a little different if you're doing it for ethical reasons, and that's where the veganism becomes a slightly different animal. If you feel because of your ethics there's a problem, it's different. But if you feel that you couldn't have trace amounts of these foods in a social situation, because they're so unhealthy, you now have orthorexia. You're probably should go speak to a counselor and ask them if they think you have it, maybe get some treatment for it. Because the case in point would be someone who is a vegan for ethical reasons would say, okay, these animals have already died. This food is going to go to waste. I'm not responsible for these animals being killed, especially if this food is going to be thrown away. Some of them ethically might actually consider the other alternative to eat some of it, so the animals wouldn't have died in vain. Like another example I gave, they might actually have that train of thought, or they might not. That's irrelevant. But the fact is, they have other options open. But if they're completely avoiding it, even in trace amounts, it's just get together, knowing the food's going to be thrown away otherwise, because they believe it's unhealthy for them to have any meat, even in small amounts on a holiday. This is now disordered thinking. This is delusional thinking, not backed by any science, not backed by any medical literature. It is now backed by their perception of the good and bad food. It's an eating disorder at that point. So that's your difference. But be aware of that, guys. Many of these exclusionary diets do have the ability to turn into eating disorders. People need to be aware of that who are going to follow these things, and they need to understand that many of these diets aren't actually backed by the scientific literature. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.